Fire Emblem Heroes, everyone's favorite love to hate, hate to love, free to play gacha extravaganza. As of the time of recording this video, Faye is over 7 years old, and, well, honestly, I feel like the game is hitting a bit of a rough patch. I wanted to make a video to take a look at where I think Faye is and what I think is going wrong with the game. Before we dive in, though, I want to preface this with just a few notes. First, I'm not making this video to claim that Faye is dying. I feel like this type of video naturally lends itself to a clickbaity mentality about the end of the game, but that's just not what I'm here to do. I've seen people predicting Faye's death since year 2 of the game. Personally, I have absolutely no idea how long it's going to last. It might die 5 years from now or 5 days from now. I don't know, and I'm not claiming to know. Second, I'm going to be talking about the game's meta and unit balance a bit here. Just in the interest of full transparency, I am not a super top player. I bounce around between tiers 19 and 20 in Arena, I generally just auto-dispatch in Aether raids, and I'd rather be hit by a truck than play summoner duels. I can say that, by the way. I've been hit by a truck, and I'd rather do that again than play duels. Point is, while I'm by no means a top player, I think I have a generally okay sense of the meta, at least enough to make some critiques. If I get some details wrong though, I do apologize in advance. Lastly, I'm actually making this video to try to be productive. I don't want this video to just be about listing out problems with the game. So while a lot of this video is going to focus around that, I'm hoping that I can propose ways that the game can still improve. Maybe, hopefully. Got it? Great. So what's going on with Faye? Well, like I said, I'm not here to claim that end of service is incoming or anything, but player enthusiasm is down. I've played the game since launch, and I've seen it in a lot of ups and downs across its life. I personally think that this is one of the worst states that I've ever seen for Faye. I personally know several longtime players and huge fans of the game who have stopped spending where they previously did, have been playing less, or have outright uninstalled. A lot of big Faye content creators have pivoted elsewhere or stopped entirely. Duels is basically collapsing in on itself, with only a small handful of players even bothering to hit the top ranks in its recent run. Banner sales have been generally declining for some time now, with a few exceptions. Okay, I'll admit, these things aren't hard data. Only IS knows how the game is truly doing. But every metric available to the player base at large is looking fairly negative. Things seem to be trending downward, with a notable amount of players quitting the game, or at least seeming less invested in it. The next logical question might be why? What's going on with the game to cause so much apathy and discontentment within the player base? Well, there's a lot to look at, so buckle up. The first, and honestly most boring answer, is simply that the game is pretty old. 7 years is a wildly long time for a gacha to last. Sure, some have gone for a really long time, but the average gacha game fizzles out within maybe 2 or 3 years, give or take. Or if it's that Love Live gacha, it'll announce end of service before the game even launches in the West. With Faye lasting as long as it has, interest is just naturally going to dwindle over time. With a very few select exceptions, most gacha games just have fewer players starting up and more players leaving as they get older. It's just how these things go, and it's fine. With that said, Faye is in a somewhat unique position in that its age brings in another natural issue. More and more characters that people care about have just been in the game for a while. Case in point, I know a player who was super excited for Jill to be added to Faye. By his own admission, once he got her in the game, he had a lot less to look forward to, and his interest fell off after. He still plays the game, but he's toned it down a lot. I kind of suspect that a lot of players are in a fairly similar boat, and that a lot of their favorites have likely been added, and there's a bit less to look forward to as the game continues. However, this actually transitions nicely into my next point, the catch-22 of modern banners. See, a lot of games are getting critically low on characters still waiting to get into the game. I think as of the time I'm recording this, Awakening and Echoes are looking at around one banner left each before they have their entire casts in the game. Several other games are very much down to their most unpopular characters left to add. Because of this, we've been seeing more banners with alts to fill in spaces. This makes sense. IS needs to slow down on how many units they're adding if they want the game to last, so I do get it. But this kind of brings in a dilemma that's tough to get around. IS naturally gravitates toward more popular characters for its banners. A lot of the alts that are showing up on both seasonals and the new Heroes banners are for characters who have a lot of alts already. This leads into a situation where neither camp is super happy. People who are still waiting for their favorites get bored of seeing the same few characters get alts over and over, while people who just like more popular characters criticize the new banners for featuring characters that they view as, well, boring nobodies. I've seen more and more general unhappiness with new banners, and I've seen the overabundance of alts taking banner slots cited as a reason for people quitting the game. It's just kind of an unavoidable consequence of the game's age at this point. I get the unhappiness around these banners, and I can understand why people are getting less interested as they see these characters get their 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th alts in the game while they're still waiting for some of their own favorites to get in the game at all after 7 years. It's really unfortunate, but it is kind of an impossible thing to get around because you really can't please everyone. Next, I want to take a look at Faye's non-competitive PvE modes, and more specifically where I think IS is dropping the ball with them. As of the time of recording this, we've gotten 2 new modes over the past year, Seer Snare and Affinity Auto Battles. Seer Snare was great. Absolutely no notes about that one. It's a fun mode that offers something different. Affinity Auto Battles, well, the gameplay of that mode consists of you watching your units do a few very easy battles with absolutely no input or decision making on your part. Okay. That's kind of emblematic of the problem with modern Faye and part of why people are losing interest. Sure, there are several modes that rotate in and out, but a lot of modes like Affinity Auto Battles, Frontline Phalanx, and Lost Lore don't even really have gameplay. When modes like those run, it feels less like there's something to actually do on Faye and more like the developers want you to hit a few buttons as busy work. And even then, there are days at a time with awkward gaps between modes. I can actually vividly remember a time when I was very sick and didn't have the energy to do much. So I pulled Faye open to kill time, but the only mode running at that point was Forging Bonds, which I had finished. I scrolled around for a bit looking for something to do, I found absolutely nothing, and I just ended up closing the game. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of modes that I think work very well. Sure, some are grindy like Forging Bonds or arguably Tempest Trials, but I'm not trying to claim that there's nothing to do on the PvE side. What I am saying is that there are times when it feels like there's very little to do on that side of things. It feels like the devs want PvP to be the focus, and, well, I'm sure that most people watching this video have been waiting for me to get to the PvP section. Let's be honest, a ton of the issues that I'm looking at here relate to the meta and how IS handles power creep. Let me again preface this section by saying that I understand the idea of power creep. Power creep is kind of the lifeblood of a gacha game. Devs have to keep releasing newer and shinier things to keep people pulling. If the power level never increases, there's not too much of an incentive for players to spend money on new things. I get it, I do. But Faye's power creep is so excessive. It's so rare for a unit to stick around the meta for more than a few months, unless they have some unique utility that keeps them relevant. To demonstrate how extreme Faye's power creep is, let's look at a tale of 3 different units: Wind Claude, Winter Byleth, and Valentine's Leon. I feel like these 3 do a good job of explaining the meta issues when you look at how they interact. Let's start by going back in time to the distant past, a time known to some as September 2023. At that point, the meta was fine. By Faye standards, it wasn't on fire, which is pretty good for this game. However, suddenly a unit called Wind Tribe Claude entered the game. Wind Claude was a nuke that was just so far above anything that had been released up to that point. He could fire off lethality against most units and destroy so many bulky tanks without breaking a sweat. Suddenly, tanking started to totally fall off as a strategy because this one unit was so strong. As the months ticked on, Claude remained strong, though counters began to emerge that kept him in check to some degree. Things settled down a little bit, and then winter came. Yes, just a few months later, Winter Byleth showed up as this unstoppable wall that could hold off almost any ranged threat. Okay, I've seen some that can crack through him with the right build, but he could just tank so much. Suddenly, Wind Claude had a hard counter and totally vanished from the meta. 3 months after his release, Claude fell off hard and almost entirely disappeared. Well, fast forward 2 more months, and we have everyone's favorite villain that you can't hate, Leon. Valentine's Leon is, at the time of writing this script, debatably the most absurd unit that Faye has ever seen. Valentine's Leon can hurl massive amounts of unblockable damage at you before combat begins, stop the turns of several units at a time, and permanently block certain units from taking turns as he demolishes your entire team. At this point, there's very, very little counterplay to what Leon can do. But my point isn't actually to just talk about 3 really strong units. Faye has had plenty of super strong meta units that have been released, seem like the most broken things ever, and eventually vanished entirely. Looking at you, Surtur and Fallen Edelgard. I'm sure that there will be a point when all 3 of the units that I mentioned are all terrible, and people will look back on this video and laugh that these units were ever considered good. My point is that there's 3 times within a span of a few months that the meta has been totally upended. I'm talking about 3 units that have invalidated dozens, if not hundreds of others just by existing. So many tanks folded to Claude, so many ranged nukes were rendered worthless by Byleth, and so many whole teams get totally shut down by Leon. That's how fast the meta moves. Who can keep up with that? I don't know how anyone but the biggest whales can actually keep up with the meta in Faye with how fast it goes, and that goes double for low spenders and free-to-play players. The game is so focused on PvP, but when the balance is that silly and things fall off that quickly, how are you going to keep people interested in building up long-term projects? Unless you're a whale who can immediately +10 merge every new unit that drops, by the time you finish most projects, they're most likely dated and struggling to keep up. This actually transitions nicely into my final point for where I think Faye is struggling. Building units. Let's say that, in spite of everything with the meta, you want to build a brand new unit up. Honestly, building units in Faye has always been one of my favorite elements of the game. Admittedly, it's always been a bit tricky to build a unit from scratch, especially a demote or a grail unit. You'll usually need several premium skills, which can take a few 5-star units to pull off. However, you'd finish a build up and more or less be done for a while until better skills showed up a while later and you'd update your build. It's always been a lot to keep up with, but it's been somewhat manageable. Well, then IS introduced Ascended Florets. Suddenly, your unit could have 2 boons if you pulled specific units to grant you this shiny new item. So you'd want to grab some of those for your favorites. Great, cool, rad. Well, a year later, IS started introducing rearmed units with arcane weapons. These inheritable weapons generally outclass most other inheritables, as well as numerous older preferred weapons. So if you want to build a new demote or an older unit, or update an old favorite, you're probably going to want one of those too. Okay, so now you're done, right? Well, no. Because then IS introduced attuned units, which give you a special skill in a new skill slot when you pull them. And fuck it, here's another new mechanic just a few months later. Emblem units, which buff your skill slots by pulling them and attaching them to your units. You'll also need both of those if you want your unit to really shine. And during this time, you're still going to need at least a few 5 stars worth of fodder and possibly months worth of dragon flowers to keep your unit's stats up to par. Oh, and with how fast new skills are released, there's a good chance that your unit's build will need updates within just a few months of you finishing it. And all of this is for one unit. And that unit probably won't even be able to keep up with the latest power creep units once you're done with all of that. There's a good chance that your shiny new unit will get walled off by Byleth or completely blown away by Leon without a second thought. You see where I'm going with this, right? It's just exhausting to try to maintain your favorites and still build new units. IS keeps introducing new mechanics that they expect you to keep up with while skills are released faster than ever. And this is during a time when power creep is at an all-time high. You can give new units all of these shiny toys, but there's a good shot that they probably can't keep up with some of the new units being released. This is how you get an exhausted player base. I was actually watching a streamed reaction when attuned units were announced, and you know what the reaction was? Groans from the streamer and sighs from chat. People are just burnt out and not able to keep up with how quickly these things are coming at them. And that's saying nothing of new players. I often try to help new players when they start up, and I frequently see them get overwhelmed by how many mechanics they have to parse through just to work on a unit or two. It just becomes too much at some point, and I think we're approaching that tipping point. To me, it feels like Faye's issues can be distilled as such. We're at a point where it's harder than ever to build a new unit optimally. However, many of these units are increasingly ineffective in the PvP modes where power creep is at its highest level ever. At the same time, a good number of PvE modes don't really offer much of a challenge and in some cases barely feature any gameplay at all. So where do players go? What do they do when they can't keep up with the meta and don't have new modes to play with? Unfortunately, I feel like the answer is increasingly becoming that they lose interest or quit outright. So what can be done at this point? How do you reinvigorate the dying embers of your player base when people are getting so burnt out? Well, I really doubt that IS is watching this, but hey, I'll throw out a few ideas. First, IS, please actually try with your new modes, please? I know you can do it. Seer Snare is genuinely really good. Players have been begging for some kind of endless mode to play during downtime. I would love to see new PvE content that's challenging but not impossible or monetized to the point that scoring is determined by how many merges you have on rare unit types. Just give us fun things to do that aren't watching units auto battle or pressing one button a day and calling it good. In fact, hey, why not introduce a new co-op mode? Live multiplayer is possible with the duel's infrastructure, so why not repurpose that into a co-op mode where we could work with our friends to kill a super strong enemy? Sort of like Rocker Sieges, but rebalanced to be less easy to break, and with co-op. That sounds fun. People have been dying for more ways to interact with their friends in Faye for ages now. If IS really can't find new modes that aren't PvP, they could at least run existing modes more often. I know that they've tried to keep the monthly orb income relatively similar from year to year, but I don't think it would kill their profits to run an extra mode here or there to keep players interested. Next, well, it's a fool's errand to even hope for at this point, but maybe they could slow down on the meta a little bit. I get the design philosophy of power creep, but maybe every project that a player has doesn't need to be invalidated every 2 to 3 months. And maybe we don't need new unit types for a while after Ascended Heroes, Rearmed Heroes, Attuned Heroes, and Emblem Heroes, on top of Legendaries and Mythics and Seasonals and Normal Heroes. Just chill for a bit on that, IS, and maybe make older skills more available before you introduce a dozen new skill lines that invalidate other ones. Give players a chance to catch up and breathe a bit. As far as the banner problems go, I guess just let more units that are a bit less popular have a few more alts. Maybe the units with 8 or 9 variants can take a back seat for a while the characters who have fans and only have an alt or two, or who haven't gotten new content in several years, can get something new. IS can probably sell a banner with more units than they're giving themselves credit for, but I will fully admit that this is a bit optimistic on my part, and they definitely know what does and doesn't sell better than I do. But that's all I've got. Hey, maybe I'm wrong about all of this. Maybe the game is doing better than ever and players are happier than they seem and there are no problems with Faye at all. But from where I'm at, it feels like a lot of players are pretty unhappy with where the game is at. And that's a shame because I like Faye. I know it probably doesn't seem like it since most of this video has been talking about the game's faults, but I do genuinely enjoy the game. I'm making this video because I like the game and want to address its problems and ideally look for solutions. If I didn't like the game, I would just quit. On that note, I would love to hear what you think. Do you agree with what I said? Do you think these problems are hurting the game? And if so, can they be fixed? I would love to hear from others and see some different perspectives on where the game is at. But regardless, I really hope that this video was at least somewhat informative if you're not really up to date on Faye's trends and where the game is standing. Either way, I really hope that you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a great day.